how did you first become interested in research on the JFK assassination?
I heard Mark Lane speak in 1964, and I went right out and bought the Warren Report volumes when they came out.
What do you consider your specialization, or do you have one? Do you focus on any particular topics?
I'd say the workings of the Warren Commission, the physical evidence as a whole, and issues of methodology.
Do you have anything that you consider your most important contribution to bringing the case into a little clearer focus?
No.
It's sort of a history that's lost in a way, or cheated. We've been cheated of the history. Do you feel that? Do you have any particular discoveries that you've made over the years?
Well, I happened to be the first person to get the Sybert O'Neill report from the National Archives. I didn't really do anything with it, much with it myself, but that's obviously had quite an impact over the years. I'm also associated with the Alvarez experiments to demonstrate that the argument from physics about the head snap and the Zapruder film is not as simple as most people were making it.
Why is this such an important issue after 3 decades have gone by now?
Darned if I know. Are the answers about the right length?
To you, important to you. I mean, maybe you're not as active as you used to be, but
yeah, but still, darned if I know, because I'm obsessive. So don't use that.
Okay.
I get to pass on
okay.
questions, right?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Sure. Okay. So do you feel there's any hope at all of resolving the case in an even somewhat conclusive manner, for history's sake?
Not really. I think.
Hold on, Dave. That's picking up real good. Let's start that.
Okay, good.
Do you feel that there's any hope of resolving this case in any way that's important to anything conclusive that we can get before history passes by and it's lost?
I could be surprised, but I really don't expect anything conclusive. I think there's a good likelihood of substantial new information on specific issues like the medical evidence and the background of Lee Harvey Oswald. But in terms of historical judgment, I think, let me think, what do I think? I think I've got about 4 hours sleep a night.
In other words, let's attack it from a different way. Do you think there's anything to be gained by a special prosecutor in a new investigation?
I think some sort of ongoing government capacity for doing investigation is important, both for what it might produce and for the message it would be giving that the government as well as the people are still concerned about issues that sometimes seem to be only historical issues.
Now, with the Oliver Stone movie, and regardless of what you may think of it personally, there was an outcry for opening the files. What files are there that you know are there that you can't get at that you would like to see?
For me personally, I would start with the medical evidence gathered by the House Committee but not published, not the autopsy photos and x-rays, but testimony of doctors and related medical evidence. Let me try that again shorter.
Okay.
For me, high on my list would be the depositions and testimony of medical personnel taken by the House Committee but not published. Also, I'd be particularly interested in military intelligence, in all military records relating in any way to Oswald, including an attempt to track down the files which were destroyed. I'd also be particularly interested in military files relating in any way to Oswald. I think it's particularly important to make an effort to reconstruct or track down copies of files which were supposedly destroyed.
Now, some people love this question and some people hate it, and you can pass on it if you want. You might like it. Of all the investigators, both public and private, who do you feel, who comes to mind as to who's contributed the most to the case? Kind of a top 10 list, but it doesn't have to be 10 names. Is that a question you feel comfortable with? Who do you admire as other researchers, perhaps, would be a better way to phrase that?
Yeah, no one has a list. I think the strength of the group is that it includes people from diverse disciplines and with really diverse ways of approaching evidence. So, for example, just off the top of my head, among journalists, someone like Tony Summers, among document researchers, someone like Sylvia Marr, among people whose orientation is political activism, someone like Carl Oglesby, David Lifton certainly as a researcher of a different kind, and far too many people to name. Obviously the problem with such a list is that I'll think immediately of the people you left out, but maybe you can cut the diversity is the strength. And among lawyers, people like Jim Lazar and Bud Fensterwald for their work in getting files.
Okay. Now, there's a lot of talk about these suspicious deaths, and some of them are terribly far-fetched, and some of them may have some merit. Do you see any credence to that idea that people have mysteriously been murdered, and it's connected to the JFK case in some way, the covering up?
It's possible that one or two specific murders may eventually turn out to have some connection to something, but one reason to be very skeptical of that idea is that the original mysterious deaths count. The idea was in part based on a very simple error in basic statistics, and some of those people who were mysteriously dead were not mysteriously dead at all, and by some accounts some of them weren't even dead. So I think the case for that is much weaker than most people think.
Okay. Now I'd like to touch on a couple of the things that you've been involved with over the years. How did the book Assassinations, Dallas and Beyond come about? You're with Scott and Stetler.
Yes, that was an anthology that we put together at Peter Scott's initiative. I believe he had gone to Boston for a conference in about 1975, and he felt at the time that there was bad information and analysis tending to drive out good, that a lot of the older good work was not readily available, and we thought it would be a good idea to have a collection of what we thought was the best of the analysis in various areas, put together, as I say, in part in response to the less persuasive information that was starting even then to dominate.
Could you touch a little bit on on your experience with the FOIA requests and the delaying and the bureaucratic red tape that went along with that, and how you dealt with that?
Well, I mainly just wrote a lot of letters and didn't expect to get anything very quickly, and things eventually came back. There was certainly a lot of inappropriate resistance to FOIA requests, not particularly mine, but certainly those of other people. I did find out years later that in response to one of my requests for an FBI document, I had made in my letter, and I believe, some reference to the possibility of a special relationship between Oswald and the FBI. And Hoover eventually said they had to give me the record I asked for, but I dislike humoring a character like Hoch, who is obviously a smear artist. And if that's what they could say about me, and I'm pretty mild-mannered, I'm sure that other people who were making FOIA requests, and we know that other people who were making requests, like Harold Weisberg, or otherwise working on the case, were subject to an awful lot of federal resistance, even at the level of FOIA.
Now, were you a consultant, or did you submit reports to, or at least did you attend the House Select Committee hearings?
I attended the hearings. I had previously been one of a dozen or so critics invited by the House Committee to present suggestions. And the critics as a whole, I and others, did submit information to the House Committee as it was doing its work, with a small effect, with some effect but not much.
Now, I know that you studied the acoustical evidence the House Select Committee found near the end that maybe helped to persuade them towards the conspiracy idea. I know it's a very complicated issue, but at the time, or in your subsequent analysis, did you find that was fairly conclusive evidence that there were shots from that direction?
I thought for a while it was conclusive, which is why I called my newsletter Echoes of Conspiracy. At this point on the acoustical evidence, the summary is that you cannot use that evidence to persuade a reasonable person that there was a conspiracy. That is, you can't
Start over.
you can't convince a reasonable person on the basis of the acoustical evidence alone that there was a conspiracy.
The question, I think, is more, were you convinced, or did you become more convinced or less convinced the more you studied it, about the conclusivity, if that's a word even, about the direction of the shots that those tests showed?
Basically, the point is, once Steve Barber discovered the crosstalk, I had gone from being 90% convinced that there were shots on the tape to 90% convinced that there weren't.
Was there anyone who found a way that that tape could have somehow passed and recorded a second time later?
I made
or maybe some dubbing, or somebody purposely altered it in some way? Is there any evidence of that?
There's no evidence. I suggested that that was a possibility which should be checked out, and as far as I know, it really wasn't. But in terms of evidence that that happened, I think not.
Okay. And one final question, and the researchers, some of them love this, some of them are kind of stumped by it. And you can think about it or pass on it if you want. I know you haven't done a lot of interviews, but some of them have, and a lot of times they complain that the people that interview them just are not well informed on the subject. Obviously, the wilderness of mirrors, and it's just an incredibly complicated case. If you were the interviewee, interviewing yourself, interviewer, interviewing yourself, what's the bottom line of this case, or what do you wish that someone would ask you about?
Well, one point which I am inclined to make to fellow critics that I think other people are not making is that what has really surprised me about the physical evidence of conspiracy that was developed in the 1960s, what has really surprised me is how much of that has either gone away or somehow become ambiguous. It's just not as strong as it used to be. And from that I draw the inference, obviously speculating, that if you looked at the other evidence of conspiracy, the non-physical evidence, I expect that most of it also would become weaker if subjected to that kind of scrutiny. In other words, 90% of all this evidence would ultimately go away. The catch is, in the 10% that remains, is there conclusive evidence? Is there something that would turn into conclusive evidence of a conspiracy? And I just don't know that. But I think it's important to keep a focus on the volatility of the evidence in this case. And in the case of the non-physical evidence, how tentative so much of it is.